On? There we go. Okay. Well, welcome to our final writer presentation of the academic year. We do have one more event for the Writers Project, and that's this Wednesday. Our President Duffy is here today, and she will be with us right smack at 12:30 in the trees in the Arboretum on Wednesday, the 30th. For our final event, co-sponsored by the Forest Bathing Book Club. We will have a reading by our graduating creative writing students. One who graduated last fall and two who are graduating this coming fall because we don't have any for this particular semester. And we'll have readings by the Forest Bathing Book Club members of their favorite nature literature. And we'll also, right at 12:30, have Dr. Duffy unveil our brand new poetry machine. So you got to be there and see it and check it out and get yourself a poem. So Megan Mayhew Bergman is an author, speaker, and teacher who writes about the natural world and remarkable women in science in a scientific and art-forward way, and likes to help others do the same. I met her last year at the Adirondack Center for Writing in Saranac Lake at their Kick-Ass Writers Festival, where she was one of the featured writers there. It was fantastic. She is the author of 3 books, Birds of a Lesser Paradise, Almost Famous Women, which we're reading in the symposium class, and How Strange a Season, which Scribner published in March of 2022. How Strange a Season was featured as a New York Times Editor's Choice and the New Yorker's Best Books of 2022 list, and was longlisted for the 2023 Joyce Carol Oates Fiction Prize, the Story Prize, and the Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Award. She is currently writing a book on the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, also with Scribner. Megan is a journalist, essayist, and critic. She has written columns on climate change and the natural world for The Guardian and the Paris Review. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Harper's Bazaar, and elsewhere. Her short fiction has appeared in Best American Short Stories for 2011 and 2015, and on NPR's Selected Shorts. She was awarded the Garrett Award for Fiction and the Phil Reed Environmental Writing Award for Journalism, and fellowships at the Breadloaf Writers Conference in the American Library in Paris. She serves on the Thoreau Prize Committee and the Board of Hildene, which is a Lincoln family home. She currently teaches literature and environmental writing at Middlebury College, where she also serves as director of the Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference. She's also an instructor in the California Coast and Climate Semester and MPA in Sustainability Program. You're gonna have to tell me how you do all that at once, and oversees an environmental storytelling series. Megan co-produced a documentary on the mountain biker, is it Lee or Leah? Leah Davison, and her photography has been published in The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Audubon, and Southern Cultures. She founded Open Field, a nonprofit geared toward increasing the accessibility of environmental storytelling and advocacy skills, and co-founded Green Story, an environmental narrative consulting firm. It is clear and apparent that I am ending the Writers Project on a very high note. We are most delighted to have Megan Mayhew Bergman.
I always have to adjust the microphone. I'm 5'3", maybe in heels. Okay. Thank you for having me. It was a joy wandering onto campus today and seeing how much this college values art, or at least that's what's stepping forward to me. And I think in these days, that's not a given. And it's really important and I think vitalizes a community. So it's really beautiful to see. I think when I think about the humanities and the value of the humanities and storytelling and art, I think about, if we were just to churn out students who only thought about profit or only thought about ones and zeros and computers, I think we'd be failing. I think, producing students who think about justice, beauty, the complexities of ethical decision making, all the things that students like you are thinking about when you engage with art is just a really well-rounded way of being in the world, and I really value it, and I'm just happy to see it here. So thanks for inviting me to be a part of that. I love to write complicated books. I love books that step into complexity. One time I was sitting at a reading with the writer Junot Diaz, and I heard him say, I was a little suspicious of him because I thought he has just these hyper masculine characters in his work. And he said in his speech, he said, I want to write characters as I've really experienced them, like how they really are and not just how we want them to be. And I think about that a lot and what creative work can do. How can we talk about the hard parts of being human, the interesting parts of being human? How can we get in there and move the needle a little bit? And I think we do that as artists by taking risks, by creating work that's not just pretty or easily consumable, but actually engages with what it means to be a human in this time. And for myself, that's just what I try to do. That's kind of my why. And I encourage every writer to be in constant contact with your own why about the work you're trying to make, why you feel called to the page or any sort of medium. What is it that makes you kind of burn for creating art, and try and stay in close contact with that because it gives your work urgency. It feels weird to talk about urgency and then tell you about a project I've been working on for 13 years, but sometimes they're just like that. Sometimes work comes out quickly and sometimes it chases you your whole life. And I sort of have a mix of both. As you can tell by my bio, which you so kindly shared, I'm a little bit of a Jack Russell Terrier. I need to be slightly overstimulated in order to function. So you probably heard that. This story landed in my lap, and sometimes my experience with publishable work is like that. It's like a comet that hits you out of nowhere or was a stranger around the corner, and this was like that. So you can move forward on the slides. First, just to kind of give you who the International Sweethearts of Rhythm are. They were the first racially integrated all-girls swing band. They traveled the Jim Crow South in violation of Jim Crow rules, so which forbade people of any sort of races mixing together on the bandstand or sleeping, in the same hotel, eating together. And the Sweethearts, and this was in the 40s, the late 30s and 40s, well before the civil rights movement of the 60s, were breaking these rules knowingly and were great musicians and were largely erased from the record. They were incredibly successful. And here are a few kind of quotes. So Maurice King later became the music director of Motown Records, was, kind of manager of the Spinners, who you may know, Marvin Gaye. And he said, I can really say that this is the world's greatest girls dance band. I almost want to cry when I think of it. And this is a man who spent his career at Motown. Like that, I don't think this is hyperbole or to be taken lightly. And then the drummer said, we were a bunch of crazy kids. I never realized we were supposed to be famous until it was all over. And Anna Mae Winburn, who was this really iconic, beautiful band leader, said that band did so much to break down prejudice in the South. They never got any credit for that because the girls went through so many things in the South that have never really been told. One of the reasons this kind of grabbed my imagination, and from Almost Famous Women, those of you that have read it, I feel really inspired by the stories of underappreciated women. And so I kind of think about it as the cocktail conversation test. If I bring this person up at a party and I say, here's this really interesting group of women or person, and the person next to me is like, I've never heard of that person, then I'm like, that's my lane. This is my mission. I want to put this woman or this group of women back in the conversation. And so really not just socially progressive group of women, but a really musically talented group of women who don't get credit on that front either. So Pauline Brady, the drummer, could keep a pace 250 beats per minute. Tiny Davis, the trumpeter, could hit a high C, which usually only Louis Armstrong and a couple of others could do. And it's just important to me that they be recognized not for just their progressiveness 20 years before the civil rights movement, but also their talent as musicians. and to think about why were women left off the record? Why have we never heard of them? And in summary, you can assume that, like most histories, even jazz can be a little racist and definitely misogynistic in the way that it treats who gets to be remembered, who was talented, who gets to be called a genius, is something that comes up for me a lot when it comes to female artists. And so in 2011, apparently at 2 a.m., an editor of the Oxford American magazine, which is sort of like highbrow culture magazine in the South, that comes out of Little Rock, sent me a pitch and was like, we're writing a Mississippi music issue. So remember how I said sometimes your content is like a comet you don't see coming? Here's the comet. So this year we get to play with the music of Mississippi, one of the most important locales in the history of music in the US. Please find below a partial listing of artists who will be on our CD. This dates things, right? The CD. Okay, you can turn the slide. And this is me choosing my fate for the next 2 decades. I just chose International Sweethearts of Rhythm, please, if they are still available. Best MMB. Changing my life right here, one line. And then he is excited. The reason I chose the International Sweethearts of Rhythm is because they were the only female group on the list. And so I always know that's what I'm going to choose. And you can move it again. So this is, the issue came out 2011. This is a picture of some of the women at the World's Fair in 1939. You can go forward. Okay, so I wrote that piece for the Oxford American, and suddenly I started becoming a de facto keeper of stories. Anytime somebody thought, oh, I had this story about the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, or I know this fact, or this person was my grandmother, I would get this. I just started receiving lots of emails. And then the Library of Congress asked me to write a little piece. And then so I want to stop and just talk about the comment on inspiration. So Liz Gilbert, who wrote Big Magic, which is a book maybe some of you have read, and if not, it's a good thing to read because it's about healing your relationship with creativity, enabling your relationship with creativity, breaking it apart a little bit from suffering in the marketplace and why do we create? What are we up to? And she says, do whatever brings you to life then. Follow your own fascinations, obsessions, and compulsions. Trust them. Create whatever causes a revolution in your heart. So that's sort of the feeling I'm looking for whenever I stumble upon material where I think that's me. This is something I can pursue for 13 years and not get tired of. And then this is one of my, I don't know if you guys know the poet Jane Hirschfeld, but she's one of my go-tos. I think she is a brilliant poet, but also a brilliant thinker. And so when she talks about why this is an answer to why write poetry, but for me, it functions as to why write at all. And one reason to write a poem, or I would say anything, is to flush from the deep thickets of the self, some thought, some feeling, comprehension, question, music you didn't know was in you or in the world. And I really love that thought, which is, we live in this world of hyper saturation of content. Everybody's creating everything. It feels like everything great has been said before. How do we connect with something that feels fresh and important? And this work we all do to give the gift of insight, beauty, humor, something to the reader. We have to give something to the reader. And we have to be committed to that act of creativity and attaching ourselves to that. And I think Hirschfeld just speaks so beautifully to that impulse. Okay. She also says to step into a poem, and I would say any writing, is to agree to risk. Writing takes down all protections to see what steps forward. And there's a certain vulnerability in admitting you're a writer or an artist, that you're chasing something, that you aspire to be in print, that you think you deserve a reader's time. And I have struggled with this over and over again in the 15 years I've been publishing. Why should it be me? Who wants to hear from me? What can I add? The imposter syndrome you get, the insecurity, that is a huge part of the artistic process, and it can be a huge block. And so for me, and working with my students, I think one of the major things a writer has to do is just to begin to confront a relationship with feedback and insecurity. And again, just connecting to, why is this important to me? Why am I the writer to write this project, and what can I offer? Hirschfeld, again, St. Jane, says, when young people ask writing advice, and this is literally the best writing advice, I sometimes say, open the window a few inches more than is comfortable. As with all offered advice, the words are tuned first to my own ear and own life. Open the window a few inches more than is comfortable. I say this to my students constantly. I think what we're trying to do here, what Jane is saying is have some skin in the game, go beyond the expected, take some risks. And I think this is what helps give the gift to the reader. Okay. So I thought before I start reading, you can try and play this video. So this is a clip of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm performing. I think it's gonna go. You might need to turn the volume on your computer, OC. There's a woman named Lee Burnside who was an exceptional alto sax player who should be really well known and isn't. One of those things that by today's standards probably doesn't feel immediately subversive, but is incredibly subversive if you think about it in 1940. So again, they're breaking Jim Crow laws because that's an international group, multiracial, biracial group of women. What's happened is that men have gone to war, to World War II, the bandstands are emptied, and now women have this strange window where they can step forward and be great. And they got wonderful band arrangers. So this is Anna Mae Winburn, who is the front woman. A lot of these girls first came together as a band as part of the Piney Woods Vocational School in rural Mississippi. They were orphans. They learned on used instruments after they had completed a massive amount of chores every day. They were not supposed to be good musicians. They were not supposed to be in the movies. They were not supposed to be on the stage of the Apollo. They were not supposed to be wearing fur coats and smoking cigarettes in a club. They eventually got there. There are also women who came out of like a vocational tradition where they were supposed to sing spirituals. Jazz, you probably heard the kind of double entendre in some of the lyrics there. Moving from spirituals to those lyrics in jazz is a big leap, right? Like that's there's a lot of agency and risk in that, especially for these women. And this appeals to me on so many levels of being early, of taking risks, not for the fact that these women did not think they weren't really in it for the money. And by the way, they were exploited by literally everyone, every manager, every school, every club, always skimming off the top. They made less than $1 a week usually. They thought they owned a house. They did not own a house. They gave money for safekeeping to their manager. The manager spent it on her own house. The school sent them out for months at a time without educating them. And all the money was being sent back to the school. There are a lot of ways in which these women were taken advantage of, and yet. And so for me, this reparative energy of let's talk about them, let's pull them back in the conversation, let's put them back in the canon where they belong and talk about why they were important and the doors that they opened. So this looks flashy and beautiful, and they were rarely recorded. So there's not a ton of evidence to go back and think about, were they just interesting or were they good musicians? Which is, I think, really an important question when writing a biography like this. A lot of them were Juilliard trained, so yes, they were good. There were not very many avenues for women to play at a really great level and to play good swing with like a really rapid pace, like these arrangements demanded of them. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And so if you were a great female musician between 1939 and 1950, this is the band where you wanted to play. Usually though, they were in a backwoods club on something called the Chitlin Circuit. Has anybody ever heard of that? So that was a series of small clubs that would actually put an interracial band on stage because the clubs themselves would get in trouble for this. So often the Sweethearts were tailed by police. They were arrested several times. So I'm going to read an opening which takes place in rural Florida in early 1940s. You can hear the juke joint before you can see it. A pounding bass drum, a kaleidoscope of horns. The moon shimmers through the Spanish moss on a hot night as headlights pan across a few orange trees and a 10-sided barn. Inside, the dimly lit dance floor is warm and crowded, body against body. A cloud of blue-tinged cigarette smoke hangs above the crowd. The club is always full when the Sweethearts come through town. Several people who have just finished shifts at the citrus groves and shipbuilding yards stand outside in a humid darkness, drinking beer, listening to the hard-driving swing through open windows. Pauline is working a drum solo in the rhythm section, then more exuberant horns combine with a rowdy piano to create a tapestry of sound. The glamorous band leader, Anna Mae Winburn, asks the crowd, "Do you want to jump, children?" And the women on the bandstand reply, "Yeah." The Sweethearts are casting their spell, skillful, bold, as capable as any band in the game. Tiny Davis struts toward the microphone and hits a high C on her trumpet. The crowd erupts. The music from the 16-piece band becomes pure energy and is pulsing through the quaking floor into hearts and limbs. Men are sweating through their dress shirts, sleeves roll. They twirl women in floral dresses, bare legs glistening, smudged makeup, spilled liquor, a stray hand on a waist, laughter. Rural Florida is known for its hot, no-frills juke joints like the Little Pearl, the Dewdrop Inn, Bucket of Blood, and the Mystery Ship. No one can play a juke joint like the Sweethearts, certainly no other all-girl band, and only a few of the all-male bands can come close. Tonight, just over the Florida-Georgia line, the music transcends the confines of the barn. It takes the musicians and the dancers away from hard times, late bills, the menace of war, the cruelty of rural America, because that's what good music can do. Pull you into another dimension, break your heart with its beauty, create a shared moment of timelessness. There's no recording of the Sweethearts' performance. Its magic is fleeting, carried only in memory and imagination. Outside, two white cops lean against their cars. They've heard the rumors about a mixed-race band, and they intend to enforce Jim Crow laws. No mingling of races on the bandstand, at dinner, or in a hotel. Later, exhausted, the Sweethearts will tell the cops the stories they've learned to tell, showing wallet photos of parents that belong to someone else, moving quickly into their Pullman bus to avoid any long glances in the moonlight. The women are Black, white, Chinese, Italian, Puerto Rican, Hawaiian, and multiracial. These women have shared a stage with Bob Hope, Billie Holiday, legendary Black comedian Moms Mabley. They've graced magazine covers and filmed movie shorts. They're radio celebrities. They played every major club willing to place an interracial band on stage. They know their way around a seedy backwater juke joint at 2 a.m. looking for the money they're owed, as well as they know the backstage of the legendary Apollo. They've made their own money, but not enough of it. They've seen every stretch of East Coast Highway several times over, run from the cops, spent the night in barns. Some of them are exceptional professional musicians. Some soloists like Bea Burnside and Tiny Davis should be legends. These women, at least some of them, drink whiskey and own fur coats. Inside the bus, Tiny is trying to sell her bandmates bologna sandwiches to make an extra buck. The maternal front woman, Anna Mae, sighs as she puts her hair up for the night, thinking about her brothers on the battlefield overseas. Roz Cron and Helen Sane open a jar of nighttime face cream and each takes a swipe. Helen Jones cracks a dry joke. The band's treasurer and saxophonist, Willie Mae Wong, braids her long black hair and worries about the money the women are owed. The band's savvy manager, Ray Lee Jones, collects wads of damp cash from the territory promoter in the dark. One or two women light cigarettes and blow smoke out of an open window into the back of the bus. They can't smoke on the bandstand or Ray Lee finds them. all the girls are coming down from the night's high so they can find the energy to do it again tomorrow and the next day for months on end. The sweethearts are more than friends in this moment. They are a sisterhood, and sisterhoods are imperfect. Sisterhoods are uneven, troubled, and loving. And despite the failures of music history, they are forever. In the winter of 2021, I stood in Catherine Russell's personal archives in New York City, shelves upon shelves of neatly organized memorabilia. Catherine's Juilliard-trained mother, Carlene Ray, toured with the International Sweethearts of Rhythm as a vocalist and guitar player. Her father, Louis, served as the band leader and pianist for Louis Armstrong. We leafed through shelves of photo albums, playbills, and vinyl records. Catherine, a singer who has released her own solo albums and sung backup for acts like Steely Dan and Cyndi Lauper, is jazz royalty. Catherine was dressed in all black with great jewelry, her hair braided and piled on top of her head in a neat bun. Catherine clocked significant time on stage as a young woman, as a dancer and singer. She's a multi-instrumentalist, powerful vocalist, and like her mother, radiates confidence and capability. Catherine told me that her mother, Carlene, held onto musical programs, photographs, and letters. She knew a time would come when people would pay more attention to the sweethearts and individual musical achievements. That was why she created the archive. As Mom was dying, Catherine explained, she said one word over and over and over again: legacy, legacy. Okay, you can flip to the next slide. So one of the things, sorry, it takes a moment. I've done this in presentation as well. Sorry, it's okay. Maybe escape. There we go. Okay, so what happens when you sell a book and then months later the nation falls into a pandemic? Oh, yeah. All the archives were closed. The Smithsonian, which held a lot of unprocessed archives from the sweethearts, was closed. Other places were closed, and you certainly can't go visit elderly people in nursing homes. All of the things I needed to do in order to write this book. So eventually, the pandemic starts to come to a close, and I'm able to get to the Smithsonian, but also what's happening here is that there are 2 living sweethearts in their 90s during the pandemic, only 2, and one of them passes away. And I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, Helen Jones Woods, who comes to be, she's really the core member of the Sweethearts. She's there from the beginning, there in the end, has an absolutely extraordinary arc. So you can see a picture here of me. I'm younger, I'm fresher, I've got a mask on. But it's funny, I love archives. I was just telling someone this minutes before the presentation, I have a huge Nancy Drew complex. I love rifling through other people's papers. I love an abandoned mansion. So archives give me that feeling. But it's not easy. It's not easy to rifle through some of these papers and make a story. So when we're talking about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we're not in digital archives. We're in, I wrote something on the back of an envelope archives. So you can see that here. And you can go to the next slide. These are some aspects of the research. One thing I felt like really hadn't come through in general jazz history and history of the South. So I grew up in the South. My first 30 years were spent in the South. Is that I didn't feel that the cost of the Jim Crow South had really been brought forward enough. I mean, how can we talk about that injustice enough? And then also just figures of American jazz. So Mary Lou Williams, brilliant pianist who should be as well known as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, was one of the only 2 people who could annotate jazz in its prime, a swing in particular, which is really hard to musically annotate. So if you want to do some justice by history, go become a fan of Mary Lou Williams, brilliant pianist. She worked with the Sweethearts occasionally and was really close friends with Carlene, who left the archive. You can keep going. So this is Tiny Davis, trumpeter, playing. She was definitively and proudly not tiny. And this was the bus that the women traveled in, which newspapers always like to talk about how fancy it was, but it was also because it was the only thing that kept them alive in some of these towns, because they were not supposed to frequent, they couldn't eat at a lot of places, especially sundown towns, driving up and down 95 and other places before 95. You can keep going. They pause after a long trip in 1941 because they are literally at the brink of exhaustion and one of their bandmates dies. So what happened was they were a fundraising mechanism for the Piney Woods School. And the Piney Woods School was started by a man, Dr. Lawrence C. Jones, and he's in Stephen Covey's book about how to win friends and influence people. He is a legend in his own right. He started the school on an overturned log when the illiteracy rate for people of color in Mississippi was massive. And he had a PhD. He came down to Mississippi to educate people of color. He had an enormous mission. He never turned anyone away. He started making also a home for blind and deaf students. Obviously, they needed to fundraise desperately to keep this operation going. I think he also developed a little bit of a blind spot about the cost of that exhaustive fundraising on the students that were out in the world playing music in order to do that, especially women. So you can go to the next phase. Here's Tiny Davis. There's Anna Mae Winburn. This character here is going to become big in just a second. That is Roz Cron. She was the other only living sweetheart as the pandemic hit. And I was beginning this project and I could not find her. I thought she was alive, but people in their 90s don't have these like flashy digital footprints that we have now. Okay, you can keep going. So I'm going to read a little bit more. This is called Love Will Live Forever. It was November 2019, 75 years after the core members of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm disbanded. I assigned my undergraduate research assistant, Ellie Eberly, what felt like an impossible task. Could she find saxophonist Roz Cron? In early December 2019, Ellie forwarded me what felt like a miracle of an email. Roz was alive. Archives are amazing. Secondhand accounts are priceless. Academic texts are critical to framing and context, but nothing beats a primary source. Someone you can ask, but how did it feel? Would Roz want to talk to me? Would she be able? Her son Joel was kind and open, but also frank. His mother still had her memory and loved to talk about the band, but she tired easily and I'd have to work with that. I agreed wholeheartedly. Roz and her son lived across the country in Santa Barbara, California. I immediately booked a flight for the following weekend. Every day that passed felt too long. At 94, Roz was the last viable living link to a band I'd studied at that time for 10 years. The day of the interview, rain fell in Santa Barbara, but it was blessedly warm, a welcome break from Vermont's frigid winter. I reviewed my notes over coffee in the hotel. I was suddenly nervous. Like any nonagenarian, Roz had good and bad days. I hoped for a good day. I looked forward to guiding the conversation in a fruitful but compassionate way. I drove my rental car to Joel's house in the California hills. He and his partner, Lisa, and their energetic pit bull greeted me warmly. Joel kindly let me look through folders of his mother's writing and collected articles. I took snapshots of everything and marveled at my luck. Roz had picked up creative writing classes in her later years and left detailed recollections of pivotal moments in her life, including eye-opening notes about the girls' wartime trip overseas. She wrote about parts of the band's life that weren't printed in magazines. After a few hours of research, Joel and I drove over to the assisted living facility where Roz lived. My heart pounded as she opened the door to her suite. The pandemic was still months away from hitting the US, and I embraced a woman I once thought couldn't be found. Roz was tiny, less than 5 feet tall. Her silver hair dyed a rich auburn. She wore glamorous red lipstick and a fresh black t-shirt featuring the silhouette of a woman playing a saxophone. Would you like tea or cookies? She asked, showing me to her couch. I looked around. Somehow Roz had managed to squeeze a piano into the room. Jazz memorabilia and family portraits lined the walls. Felt tears forming in my eyes as we talked. I couldn't believe Roz was here, in front of me, and that her memory was intact. She seemed genuinely thrilled to talk about the band. I watched as she came alive with stories, steadying herself in the past. And when she talked, she alternated between a persistent smile and a seriousness that spoke to her continued commitment to jazz and her bandmates. She told me about drinking whiskey with trombonist Helen in a cab after the 2011 Smithsonian Honors, the way German kids marveled at trumpeter Tiny on the USO tour and the time Roz was arrested for walking down the street arm in arm with a Black soldier. We talked for hours. Each minute, each story felt precious. Eventually, I sensed Roz's fatigue and tried to say goodbye, but she wanted to keep going. She showed me yet another folder of photos, including ones from the war, and these photos were somber and full of gravity. She showed me photos of the sweethearts in attractive uniforms, but also powerful and gruesome images of newly liberated concentration camps. The sweetheart story is often like this, yoked with profound historical moments. Jim Crow, World War II, the dawning of the civil rights movement, and second wave feminism. As the interview wound to a close, Roz put on a crisp white hat, a gift from her son. The script, rendered in blue embroidery, reads Macron, a nod to the French president whom she liked, but also a play on words for Mother Cron. I was sprawled out on her floor, photographing everything as a nurse's aide came in with medicine and a small cup of water. Are you famous? She asked Roz, puzzled. I had no idea. Roz sighed and touched an arthritic hand to her temple. Maybe a long time ago, she said humbly. Yes, I insisted she was. The nurse looked pleased. It must be confusing for Roz to explain what a phenomenon the band once was. At one time, Ella Fitzgerald was an opening act. Louis Armstrong attempted to poach trumpeter Tiny for his own band, and bandleader Anna Mae Winburn graced the cover of Jet magazine. But Roz has outlived her peers, and her reference points no longer resonate the way they did in decades past. Roz was insistent about one point in particular. We truly loved each other, she said to me about the band. Before I left to return home to Vermont, I asked Roz about her favorite piece of music. It was something from the war years, she said, narrowing her eyes. Maurice King wrote it especially for me. I can't think of the title. Having just looked at one of the USO wartime programs, I suggest a title. Love Will Live Forever? She closed her eyes, satisfied. Yes, she repeated. Love will live forever. But there was also a wince, perhaps a beat of pain as Roz reached back to a time where she felt most alive, and surrounded by the music of friends that she loved and has now outlived. Sometimes, Joel told me, she still hums the old tunes. Once, years ago, she said, I searched everywhere for the sheet music, but I couldn't find it. I even visited the Library of Congress, but no one had the score. Roz never located Love Will Live Forever, and despite years of research, neither can I. Months after my first visit with Roz, fires swept California. The pandemic endangered nursing homes and prevented women like Roz from having regular visitors. She stopped dyeing her hair, its signature auburn color. After my first visit, Roz and Joel called me on FaceTime as I sat at my daughter's soccer game back home in Vermont. We talked about Roz's date with Count Basie, what it felt like to cross the ocean for the USO tour while fearing U-boat attacks and battling seasickness. She didn't know how to hold the iPhone, and at times, all I could see were her eyebrows. Another day, my daughters and I sang to her as she ate a piece of cake outside of her assisted living facility, Joel watching over her. I began to know Roz as a human, not just a research subject. As the pandemic worsened, so did Roz. She called Joel at odd hours, confused and anxious. Like many older people, she was cut off from the world when she needed it most, isolated from the people who kept her rooted to the present. Joel, a devoted caretaker, made sure there was soft jazz playing in her room and asked the nurses not to use the term hospice in front of her. Throughout the challenging last weeks of her life, Joel remained a careful and intelligent guardian of his mother's fierce spirit. She is strong, he assured me, as the end was near. Joel and I stayed in touch throughout Roz's decline. I didn't hear from him for a few weeks and was not surprised when the text came through that she had died. Roz was buried on an extraordinarily beautiful California day with blue skies and bright sun. Joel suggested a toast of cheap vodka in his mother's honor during the otherworldliness of a Zoom funeral. I feel Roz's absence in the world, and like many others, I worry about the stories lost with the passing of her generation. What it cost the world to allow racism to flourish, and what it cost women to live during times when they were treated as less than human. Okay, we can go to the next slide. You can see if it'll play, but it's a video of my interview with Roz. You can keep going, but I just wanted to give you a little clip of, I'm seated here on the floor just in awe of this woman of please tell me everything. And she was so clear when it came to the past, less clear about the present. This is a picture of them. This is Maurice King, later head of music development and style at Motown. This is Roz. This is her friend Mem. You can see mixed race band heading over. when the government issued them their uniforms, because they were considered a mostly black band, they gave them insufficient winter gear. They had to borrow gear from the soldiers in order to stay warm. And their accommodations were not, I don't think anyone's accommodations were luxurious during this era overseas, but theirs were particularly not. But you can see Roz in her US issued USO uniform. Okay, you can keep going.
Great.
That's okay.
It's not cooperating. Let me try again.
Maybe click on the slide deck. That's okay. You can keep experimenting. I'll read a little bit to you guys about, it sounds really moving, some of this research, and it was, but there were also times where I really goofed up. And research is tough this way. So this is a chapter called Dixie. In 2021, I came across the name of a woman who had donated boxes of Sweethearts memorabilia to the Smithsonian in 2012. Dixie Hardy Moon. It was a remarkable and beautiful name, and I was intrigued. Further research revealed that Dixie Hardy Moon was Dr. Lawrence C. Jones' niece, and she'd lived on the Piney Woods campus for many years with her mother.
I'm sorry, is that her?
Oh, no, we'll get there. That's good. You can just leave it there.
Okay.
In 1917, remaining there with her daughter, Dixie, until her retirement as school postmistress in 1972. From what I could tell, Dixie Hardy Moon had no digital footprint. Records indicated Moon was 93 and living in New York. In December 2021, I wrote an email to her relatives. Quote unquote, I have been trying to get in touch with a relative of yours, Dixie Hardy Moon, to interview her about the International Sweethearts of Rhythm. I understand she may be quite elderly and an interview might not be possible, but perhaps one of you might be willing to chat with me. In January 2022, I was cooking dinner. I live in an 1834 farmhouse in rural Vermont. My kitchen is full of 4 rescue dogs, 2 cats, 2 daughters looking to be fed. My phone rang. I answered, balancing the phone between my ear and shoulder while stirring kale into a pot of soup in progress on the stove. I hear you want to talk to me, a voice, old but still vital, said. May I ask who this is? I said, Dixie. For a moment, my mind went dark, grasping for who Dixie might be. Then it dawned on me. Dixie Hardy Moon? Yes. I hear you think I'm too elderly to give an interview. Her relatives had relayed my message in its exact form, and I could hear Moon was genuinely offended. My mind works perfectly well, she said. Now, what do you want to know? I was suddenly ashamed of the assumptions I'd made about her faculties and her age. It would not be the first or last time in this research process I was impressed by the sharpness of a nonagenarian. Because I hadn't anticipated her phone call, I had not prepared questions and was holding a spoon over a pot of boiling soup. I did not want to waste the opportunity to speak with this living link to my material. I also wished to assure her of my respect and gratitude, but I could tell she was already suspicious. I couldn't really blame her. Interviews can feel extractive, even if you hope to build a long-term relationship. I was wondering if you could say more about what kind of person Consuela Carter was, I began, pronouncing the band director's name, Consuela. Consuela, Moon said, correcting me. Consuela, I repeated. She taught gymnastics in addition to music, had high expectations for the students. She could be exacting, Moon added. I wanted to find that next level of depth. What was Dr. Jones really like? How did he feel about the band as they came into their own and began to distance themselves from the school? But getting to those parts, characterizations, private conversations, emotions, impressions, takes a trusting relationship, and I had fumbled my introduction to Moon. She was a truly elegant woman, Dixie wrote in her mother Nellie's obituary in 1999, who served as an example for all the women in her family and all the women whose lives she touched. This obituary noted Nellie's faithful support to Jones and Piney Woods, and this very quality was coming forth in her daughter, Dixie. I've taught nonfiction writing and environmental communications at the graduate and undergraduate levels. In the last few years, I've added course components that speak to the ethics of the interview process. Ideally, when we step into a community to learn, we seek first to understand as much as we can about that community's history. Next, we do our best not to practice parachute journalism, jumping in with extractive questions, getting what we need, and leaving. In an ideal world, the journalist builds meaningful relationships. In many of my interactions, I'm good at this. I've raked up dead marsh grass from an interviewee's yard. I've brought coffee and stayed for a long chat in the sun. I followed up years later to check in. When researching a nonfiction piece, I want to find the question that gets to some emotional reality that exists outside of the sanitized version shared in prior articles. I hope for some dose of reality or a character detail that has been waiting to come out that will make the story more alive and true. But occasionally, I also become aware of the fact that what serves the story may not serve the interviewee. And I've never been great at holding people in discomfort. It's not a place I like to be as a human being. So if I sense someone is uncomfortable, I tend to fall back, and I could feel myself doing so as each minute passed on the phone with Moon. I could picture Moon, herself a student at the school, living alongside the sweethearts as they rose to unlikely stardom and tensions began. What private conversations and honest moments had she been a part of? What might she be willing to share with me? How did Dr. Jones feel when the band started to push back about the working conditions? I asked, hoping to get a firsthand account. There was no way to keep the school going without fundraising, Moon said. The band was created in order to fundraise. That was the deal. She offered factual but perfunctory answers. I could sense a deep loyalty in her to Jones, to her mother, to Piney Woods, and it made sense to me. Her loyalty was profound and beautiful, even as I felt she was holding back details that might now never be known. Something I've learned as a writer of historical fiction and as a journalist, each part of a complex story has its guardian. Thank you for your time, I said. If you ever think of a story or detail you'd like to share, I'd love to listen. We hung up. I stirred my soup. Suddenly I thought of 100 questions. Sometimes it makes me ache, thinking about each year passing and the details of a story disappearing with time, tossed boxes, people, and memory. Let's see, I'm not gonna hold you here too long. I'm going to tell you about this portrait. Maybe I'm just going to tell you about the portrait and not read. One of the interesting things about writing a long nonfiction book is synchronicities, strange things that happen that you didn't expect to happen, stumbling into like really amazing material. So once I couldn't find the radio programming of the Sweethearts from the wartime, and I found it on some really obscure blog, and like hearing them in this moment in Paris in the 40s for the first time just cracked something for me. Another time I was talking to Anna Mae Winburn's children, and they were telling me about her life. She was one of 12 kids. She ran away from home essentially at 14 to fend for herself. She fronted many male bands in the Omaha area before making a break for the Sweethearts. She kept the Sweethearts alive for a long time, into the 50s, kind of past the era where this kind of music was quote unquote cool. She was devoted to the band, and she had 4 kids, was pregnant on the road, performed pregnant, had her children on the bus. Her husband was a manager for a while. He was beaten savagely. Life on the road for performers in this era was brutal, particularly performers of color. After she kind of retired from singing, she had no money, so she began cleaning houses. And then she developed Alzheimer's. And she was elegant until the end. I've seen videos of her. Her children told me she was amazing at thrift store shopping and just keeping like a certain sense of pizzazz. But when I was talking to her children, it was clear how much they revered their mother and what she had brought with her as a parent from her experience overseas at the close of the war. And her daughter said, "Wait just a minute, I've got something to show you." And I saw her walk to a closet and come back with this giant roll of canvas. And she unrolled it for me, and it was this portrait, which is huge, and probably belongs in a museum. It's really gorgeous. But basically, a German soldier was starving, and Anna Mae gave him her rations, her food, in exchange for this portrait. It's a really complex exchange for that moment. And yeah, what a time, right? This is a picture of, they all had promo pictures around this era. And so you can see Tiny writing to Roz. And one of the things I feel careful about in this story is not making it overly successful or beautiful in the terms of like, what a utopia, because it wasn't. Everyone was at risk. The white women were at risk. The women of color were at risk by virtue of what they were doing. And they all did it intentionally, but it wasn't utopian. And I think it's important to think about that. And there was real risk here. And so when I was researching, one of the things I was looking for in the press, they were always like, we love each other. We love each other. But did they really love each other? You know, like I had that question, and it's really interesting to find the private letters between them when no one was watching, their inscriptions to each other. They did really love each other. So I'm sure they were, you know, living together on a bus, that many women, that many cycles. That's a lot of feelings on a bus. Okay, let's try the next slide. So this is the women in 2011, those that were left. You can see Roz with her auburn hair. You can see Helen. Those were the last two that were alive in the pandemic. And they were interviewed for the Smithsonian. It was nice to see them get some recognition, but they're still not in the public consciousness. And I think that's what would be ideal for people to know their story. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. It's a long, winding story. I've just sort of settled on the fact that you know, it's weird to feel like the keeper of a story. There are lots of academics who know portions of this story. Their families know portions of the story. I've included a section in the back of the book for their families to say in first person how they feel and what they want people to remember. That feels ethical to me. For me, writing this story, I've thought a lot about how to be in service of a story and not in service to myself. And it's a distinction I think a lot about, you know, really coming back around to my why about why am I writing this? Why do I want people to read this? I want people to know about them. I want people to understand the risks they took. I want people to understand that they were exceptional musicians and they were exceptional women. So I'll conclude there, but I want to open it up. I know some of you have read Almost Famous Women. There's a story about the sweethearts there that's fictional. But largely I'm often talking about climate. I really love writing about the natural world because again, I want to talk about what's not being talked about. So a tip to you as writers is look for the voids. Where is something misunderstood? Where is something undertended? Where's something lacking nuance and complexity? Where's something that has an angle that only you can add and find it? I think looking for voids, looking for those places where you feel like, I really wish people understood X, that might be your lane. That might be something to lean into. And that's one of the places I've always kind of found my work. So thank you for your time, and I'd love to open it up to questions. Sorry for my random heavy breathing in the microphone. Didn't know it was such a problem, but I guess it is.
Do you ever find yourself in a project like this kind of at a fork in the road? Like, you know, there's only so much time, people's lives are finite, the archive's closing in 10 minutes. And how do you make that? I could pursue this, I could pursue that, I could go back and look for the thing I put down yesterday. Yeah. Seems like it could be really overwhelming.
I think you just nailed what makes this book really hard. At a practical level and a technical level. You're right. There are so many aspects of these individuals that deserve entire books. And also technically, it's very hard. When you're writing a biography about one person, you can train the reader's heart and mind on one person. When you're writing about a band of a cast of characters that changed over time, and again, everyone's talented, interesting, has a compelling arc, how do you keep the reader's heart engaged? And I really struggled with that. I've also really struggled with what was happening in the 30s and 40s and trying not to constantly apply a contemporary context or contemporary framework to that, because I think that starts to develop a sort of righteous energy that's not appealing. So, you know, it's how to let the story breathe, how to let people in. And it's hard, and I think that's one of the reasons it's taking so long. So you're right. I mean, I feel constantly bewildered about the different shapes and angles this could take. And I think I just try to think of myself there. You know, there have been some interesting scholars that have come before me, like Sherry Tucker is a jazz scholar at Duke, and she wrote a book called Swing Time that's about this moment for many female bands where they have some space to breathe in the 40s. It's a really academic text. It's not something that I think the general reader can pick up. So I'm thinking about my role on this is trying to write for a general reader and just thinking myself as part of the conversation, not the entire conversation, but just part of it. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about the composition and revision process for Almost Famous Women. It's fascinating. The research must have, I mean, I would have gone down a rabbit hole on any one of those characters. There's so many characters, and you do a Joycean thing too. You adjust your style sometimes to accommodate the person you're writing about. What was your timeline like for that, and what was your process?
Yeah. I'm sure you guys have heard the advice, write the book you most want to read. Almost Famous Women is literally that book for me. I was truly writing the book I wanted to read, and it is actually a representation of my Wikipedia rabbit holes, I think. And it's most like unglamorous blurb form. I think I had just become a mother. I was a young mother. I was trying to build my career. I was in my early 30s as I was writing this book. And I think I was thinking a lot about the choices women make in order to build lives they care about, the risks that they take, the risk of stepping outside of a lane. And I felt I felt my attention drawn to women who were just taking those risks, and oftentimes we're sort of punished for them. I mean, it's a sort of cautionary tale and also triumphant. It's that mix of, pursuing fame. I think fame is not necessarily a good end. And so there's an upfront quote from Ezra Pound sort of about chasing fame. And then there's a quote from Janis Joplin that says you can fill up your life with ideas and still go home lonely. So I think it was the cost of chasing ideas that fascinated me. So I think it was just pursuing that. And I didn't feel very actualized as a person in my early 30s. I was living in a small town. I was mostly cleaning people up as a mother. And I think I was drawn to, okay, show me some woman who was, on a motorcycle or owned her own island, or was racing boats, or show me something. So sort of inspiring myself, but really focused on the lives women lead. And another thing that I think tends to be a preoccupation for me is the idea of feminine genius and how rarely that is accorded. I mean, even as they've been developing AI is limited in its understanding of the gender of genius, and it's a term so rarely applied to women. So I think there's something in me that has this kind of reparative fascination with outside of the lines women. Yeah. Yes, in the back. Yeah, I would say they were often footnotes in other people's stories. Like there's one about Norma Millay, Edna St. Vincent Millay's sister, who, is a famous modernist actress and quite a character. And I just thought about that and the way when Edna St. Vincent Millay died, I think drunk by falling down the stairs. That's not funny. It's not funny at all. But her sister, sorry, dark humor, I guess, but her sister preserved even the mouthwash in the bottles, and just really preserved this estate and protected her sister's reputation. And psychologically, that intrigued me. So it was often, and I had stayed at the Millay Colony for the Arts. That was the first time I took a month away from my corporate job to work as a writer, and everything felt so haunted. It was underfunded, like a lot of arts institutions were. I lived in a barn for a month, and it was so good for me. It was so good for me as an artist. So I think I just felt Norma in that property and in that space. And I guess my Nancy Drew complex was acting up a bit. you know, Lucia Joyce, I was teaching modernism at Bennington College, and I think she appeared as a footnote, and I read the biography, Lucia, about her. I think I'm intrigued by the way we sometimes present women in the sanitized historical version. And there were a lot of women I would come across and I would think, but what was it really like to be you? What were you angry about? What hurt you? How did you feel, you know, when you took this risk? I think it was those questions. Yeah, thank you.
A two-part question, and I just want to say that I liked a lot of the quotes that you brought up. I thought that it was very inspiring to people that are aspiring, you know, just artists, writers, what have you. But my question for you at one point said to ask yourself as a writer, what draws you to the page? I'm going to throw the same question at you. What draws you to the page? And this is kind of a lighthearted question, but while you were going through the archives and like videos that you could find of the Sweethearts, did you find like a favorite song? Like, would it be Jump Children or what would you think?
Love that question. I'll start with the favorite song. I love swing, but I think, you know, if I'm driving in my car, I wouldn't be like, you know what I want to listen to right now, swing. But I think I'm passionate about what the women did. And in my research, I found Tiny Davis started a band after the Sweethearts era called Tiny Davis and Her Helldivers. And she just leaned way hard into risk taking after the Sweethearts. So she and her partner Ruby, and you can find videos of Ruby and Tiny online speaking about their relationship. It's really moving and beautiful. Ruby was the bus driver for the Sweethearts for a bit and also a musician. And they opened a club in Chicago called Tiny and Ruby's Gay Spot. And they had a wild time. They had a really wild time. They were even stranded on the freeway in a snowstorm, and people had to airdrop food to them while they were on the road. And I like some of her music from that era. And she's playing with her daughter Dot. There's one, it sounds like a Tom Petty song, but it's called Stop Dragging My Heart Around that I really love. So I love that question. And as for what draws me to the page, I mentioned it a little earlier on, and I think I'm embarrassed to admit this, which probably means it's right. When I was younger, I loved reading old Nancy Drew books, and that is really cliche, and I recognize how cliche that is. But it was one of the only places I could find a strong female protagonist, and Nancy's pretty annoying. Honestly, she's good at everything. She can like fly planes and skate, and she's it's pretty terrible. I think I might have been more into George, her cousin, and then they were always talking about how Bess, the other cousin, needed to lose weight. They don't hold up. They don't hold up at all. But I think the idea of three women chasing down criminals. I love amateur detectives. I also love Murder, She Wrote. I mean, none of this is literary or cool. But I think there's something in that haunted mansion, undertold story, you know, somebody who's old, who lived a really fascinating life. There's something about that probably in the 80s just went deep when I was growing up. And I think I'm always trying to recreate that feeling for myself. I love undertold stories. I love the idea of putting a light on them, mostly because I feel frustrated by my experience growing up in the 80s South about the very limited scope of what womanhood was shared with me, what I thought it could be in terms of could women work, what jobs could they have, what choices could they make. And I love seeking out examples of people that expand that notion to me. Thank you for that question.
Are there any women in modern entertainment that you think would be left behind in the future, or do you think that's a possibility with the digital footprint that people have now for women?
That is a great question. I mean, it's fascinating to think about. I often thought about archives and how digital everything is now. I am not going to be an important author when it's all said and done, but if someone did consider me that, good luck finding anything in my inbox. You know, it's going to be grocery lists. You know, just this idea of what the archives will be anyway. I guess your work, you know, will have to speak for itself in that way, and you know, you won't have the letters, like the physical material culture, perhaps as much. I do think we have a better but still limited dialogue on what constitutes good work and good art. I think right now we're really driven by the market, and I think it's an interesting thing for writers and artists to think about, which is, am I making work for the market? If so, what is my readership? If I wrote in a way, I always tell my students, like, I can't just rely on my writing. I could never make an income, a livable income that I could feed children with as a writer. So, and if I did rely on it for that, I'd have to make such compromises about what I think art should be that I would no longer love my work. And my mom is always just like, hey, it'd be great if you, wrote one of these paperbacks in the grocery store. And I don't think I could. I mean, I would love to. I would love to do a pseudonym and write a beach read. I'll try. I might. But I don't even know if I'm capable of that. But it's interesting to think about what can feed you as an artist versus what are you committing to making? What do you want to see in the world? What's your why? I think the older I get and the more I see the suffering in the world, the more I feel really committed to my why, and why I do what I do and the kind of art I want to make and the voids I still see. And I think there are women that are really getting into that right now. I think a lot of it was like female directors. I haven't seen Baby Girl, but like things that are really moving the needle, that are shocking, that are provocative, and not just provocative to be provocative, but provocative in a look at women in a different way. Do I think history will necessarily remember them? Possibly not. I still think when you look at awards, the history of literary awards, the history of film awards, it still airs in one direction. So it's a great question. And I think it will be interesting to keep thinking about why and what. And I honestly hope my work contributes to highlighting potentially underappreciated people who played important roles. Yeah, thank you for that question.
This will probably have to be the last question, but how do you get people to care about the environment?
I wish I could solve that question. I've worked with an Italian director, and so I want to give her credit for this statement, but it kind of like the Jane Hirschfeld quote, open the window a few inches wider than is comfortable. This quote that I'm about to share from a director called Laura Lucetti, she said, we have to hide the medicine in the cake. And for me, I think the cake is narrative and storytelling. I think people generally, as readers and viewers, we're allergic to self-righteousness. So if something feels like a problematic uncle's monologue on Facebook, no one's going to be like, tell me more, so we want to avoid talking about things that we care about with that self-righteous, amped up energy, and instead take people on an arc of discovery. This is hard, or this is how I discovered, that there are microplastics in my baby's body, or things like that. It's also about not using too much jargon, not being elitist. I think generally the environmental movement is terribly elitist. And I think people feel like they have to pass some purity test in order to like engage in those conversations. And I think widening the aperture of who can consider themselves an environmentalist or engage in that sort of storytelling. I think the trick is to become more hyper local. Like we can't necessarily invest in ideas about polar bears here, or even sea turtles in the Adirondacks, but we can talk about how the ice is changing on the lakes or how fishing is changing in a more on the ground, hyper local way. And I think that's where storytelling can really succeed. Yeah. Thank you guys for your attention today.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was amazing. Thank you all for being here. And I just wanted to thank the administration for supporting the Writers Project, the Faculty Student Association for providing some refreshments, and all of you. Thank you. Nancy.
Just line doing that. Oh, yeah, right. And I agree.